You're watching a lesson on managing Active Directory domain services using Windows PowerShell. But what I want to do with you in this lesson is just specifically go through the PowerShell commands, or as we'll learn, they're actually called commandlets, but the different commandlets that you would use to specifically perform certain functions within Active Directory domain services. Now, real quick, before we get into the actual PowerShell commands themselves, there's a couple other things I need to go over with you first. The first item here is I need to make sure that you are clear on what an LDAP distinguished name is, or what sometimes you will see referred to just in parentheses as DN for distinguished name. What this distinguished name is it's a unique database name for every Active Directory object. Okay, so it's every single object in the entire Active Directory infrastructure is going to have some form of unique name. I mean, we talk about uniqueness all the time, right? In other words, every object will also have a unique SID, right? Unique security identifier. Well, in this case, it's an actual unique database name. But to take it a step further, I can tell you that it's made up of a hierarchical sequence of relative distinguished names, or RDNs, connected by commas. Okay, so not only is the name unique, but it's also set up in a hierarchical fashion so that it truly represents where in the database a particular object is located. Now, I have a couple examples here. The first one says CN equals John Smith. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Before we get to the comma that follows that, before we get to anything else after that, that CN equals John Smith means just a common name equals John Smith, right? That's the name we know it as. Well, that object with the name John Smith is a relative distinguished name within its own container. Now, what do we mean by container? Well, let's move on past the John Smith and we'll see what we're talking about. After the comma, we have OU, which of course stands for organizational unit, equals NY sales users. Okay, so what we're saying is in the NY sales users container, okay, relative to that container, there is only one object that's going to be truly named John Smith. Okay, and that's this user account. So CN equals John Smith, comma, OU equals NY sales users, comma, OU equals sales. And the reason we have that is because the New York sales users organizational unit is inside the sales organizational unit. And you'll notice that after that, we have another comma, which then says OU equals New York. Why? Because we have a top level OU, which is called New York, which then has the sales OU, which then has the New York sales users OU, which then has the user John Smith. But even though New York is a top level OU, we still have to continue from there because there's still another level up, and that's the domain itself. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and people mess this up all the time. After the New York, we see comma DC, which, by the way, stands for domain component, not domain controller. Okay, the term DC typically stands for a domain controller. Here it means domain component equals globomantics, comma, not dot. Okay, a lot of people make a mistake here and they'll say DC equals globomantics.local. That's not correct. It's DC equals globomantics, comma, DC equals local. I also want you to notice that that entire string is in quotations. And the reason it's in quotations is because, first of all, we have commas. And anytime we are scripting, a comma could represent an actual function within the script. And since these LDAP distinguished names are used in scripts, we need to put it in quotes so that those commas are recognized as all being part of this distinguished name, not a command or a change of a command in a script. Another reason for the quotes, and this is something that we've always seen typically over the years, is notice that certain components of this distinguished name, like John Smith or NY sales users or New York, there's a space involved. So again, in order to let the script know that that space is not actually a separator in the script, but it's actually part of the name, we put it all in quotes. So that's what a typical LDAP distinguished name looks like. Now I have a second example here, and there's something very specific that I want to point out with this example. And the second example is CN equals administrator. Okay, and you can see where we're heading with this. We're going with the built-in administrator account. But notice that after the comma, we have CN equals users. Now that confuses a lot of people because they say, well, wait a minute, isn't users an organizational unit? Isn't that a container? Well, because the users container is a built-in container, it is not considered to be an organizational unit. It's just a container. And so for that particular container, we actually use CN instead of OU. So you can see that the rest of this continues the same way as the other, where we have DC equals globalmantics and DC equals local. But I just wanted to point out to you that the users container and other built-in containers are going to be represented in their distinguished name as CN, not OU. Now there is one exception to this rule, and it's the domain controller's container. It's created by default, but it is considered to be an OU. When we get into the actual operating system, I will show you how you can tell the difference between an OU and then just a built-in container. Now, the other thing that I need to go over with you before we get into the PowerShell commands is I just want to talk to you about some of the traditional Active Directory bulk management tools. Okay? Before we had PowerShell, we still had a way of doing things from the command line. And one way was through something called CSVDE, which, and I'm not even going to go into the literal, what the letters stand for, comma separated value, blah, blah, blah. Just CSVDE. This was an actual tool. That's the other reason why I don't want to worry about what the letters stand for, is because it's a literal tool, and it still exists. This is a tool that can import and export Active Directory objects from or to .csv files, or comma separated value files. Now these are special files that are set up with a line header. Okay, we have that very first line on the file where we would actually have the titles of all the different fields. And then every line in the rest of the file after that would have the actual values themselves. Okay, you'd have the actual names of the users, names of the groups, names of the various objects that you're looking to import or export. And actually, I should clarify, it would be the names you want to import. If you were to export using this tool, you would end up creating this comma-separated file. Now, another traditional tool that we've always had available, and is still available today, is LDIFDE, LDIFDE. And this is another command line tool that can be used to import, export, but also modify or even delete Active Directory objects using, well, LDIF files. It kind of makes sense that CSVDE uses CSV files and LDIFDE uses LDIF files. Again, I'm not going to go into any real detail. This is kind of the old way of doing things. Some people thought of it just easily as a line delimited instead of a comma separated file. What would happen is you would have sections within this file for every single item. You would have a literal like name equals, and you'd have password equals, and things like that that would all be together to go ahead and import, export, modify, or delete Active Directory objects. Where this tool was typically used, and actually I'll tell you where both of these tools were typically used. CSVDE was typically used with migrations. If you need to just kind of export everything out of one Active Directory domain and then be able to quickly and easily import it into another. Because the creating of these CSV files by hand is not easy. But if you were to export, the file is created for you. That way you could easily import. Where LDIFDE was typically used was when you wanted to modify a lot of objects. If you had a lot of objects that you wanted to, let's say you had some kind of a reorg and you wanted to change the name of a department, maybe that was listed on everybody's account. Well, you could do it through the LDIFDE file. You could go ahead and quickly and easily export out all of your objects, do a find and replace. It's just a simple text document, And then you go ahead and import it back in, or again, you don't even have to import because the objects were never actually deleted from the database. You just did a modify with the new LDIFT file. The other thing that we had available to us and still have available to us are the DS commands. You see I have them listed here: DSAdd, DSGet, DSQuery, DSMod, DSRM, and DSMove. And they're fairly obvious. In other words, DSAdd, what would you do with that? Well, you would add an object. You could create an object. Okay, DSGet, DSQuery. How about DSMod for modifying? Here's one for you, DSRM. You know what RM stands for? Remove. I don't know why they couldn't just call it DSDelete. But that even goes back to the old days of DOS, where they had RM or REM, or depending on what version you were looking at, to remove something instead of deleting something. And then, of course, DSMove. So anyway, those are some of the commands that were available. And again, why did we use these? Well, for scripting, right? Because even though a particular command line entry may not be that easy, in other words, it may be a fairly lengthy entry, and we're going to see the same thing in PowerShell. The idea is if you can create something once from a command line, you can then script it and do it many times over again. And that's where this all comes in real handy instead of using the GUI. Okay, so now that we have gone through and learned what an LDAP distinguished name is, and we've seen some of the traditional tools that were available, well, let's look at some of the specific commandlets that are available now with PowerShell. Now I'm going to kind of go through these pretty quickly because there's, a lot of this is fairly obvious and or redundant. So these are just a bunch of charts that I'm going to show you here, which kind of show all the different commandlets that are available to you. Then in a few minutes, we're going to jump over to the operating system and we'll play with PowerShell just a little bit. So when it comes to user accounts, you will see here that we can use something like new AD user to create a user account, set AD user to modify a user account, remove AD user to delete the account, and then from there you'll see there's a number of other things as far as setting password, setting expiration, unlocking the account, right? If an account gets locked out, you could write a quick script to unlock a user's account. It's not like it's that hard through the GUI, but it might be easier with a script, and then you just click on an icon. And then, of course, we can enable and disable user accounts. Now, since a lot of what tends to get done, when it comes to bulk transactions, which is why we use scripting and why we use PowerShell, it really comes down to the, probably more often than not, the creating of objects. So when it comes to creating user accounts, I just have listed here a bunch of parameters that are available to actually set the specifics of a user account. Okay, you'll see here you can set an expiration date, you can establish a password, you can establish whether they have to change password at next logon, you can put in a department, you can choose whether the account is enabled or not. Okay, and again, these are kind of like parameters that are included when using the new AD user command. Okay, just so you're not confused with the fact that enabled, there was also a command specifically to enable an account. This is a parameter that you would use while creating the account, because it is disabled by default if you don't establish anything. You can put in a home directory, a home drive, which again, those are very similar, but the home directory is the actual location, whereas home drive is the drive letter that will be mapped. The given name, the surname, and a path. In other words, where are we actually creating the account? Okay, so this is not everything, but these are maybe some of the typical things, some of the typical parameters that you would use when creating an account. Now to move past users, and we move here into group accounts, you'll notice it's very similar, right? You have new AD group, set AD group, okay, that would be the same, or we even have a remove AD group. There is a new one here, it says get AD group. This would be for the properties of the groups. You can add an AD group member or get AD group member for adding members or displaying the membership. Or of course we could add to that remove AD group member to take someone out of the membership of the group. We have add, get, and remove AD principal group membership. Okay, so it adds a particular group membership to an object as opposed to adding a member to a group. It's kind of like going the other way around. Again, when it comes to actually creating the group accounts, some of the parameters, you have your name, you have the scope. Now it's officially here called group scope, which is the scope, display name, group category, which is actually the type. And even though it says category, it's what we've previously referred to as type of group, either security or distribution. You can establish who it's managed by, again, the path, and a SAM account name for the pre-Windows 2000 name for the group. And quickly here, and then we'll jump over to the operating system, just looking at computer accounts, you'll see, again, I mentioned this is going to get a little bit redundant in the sense that we have new AD computer or set AD computer or remove AD computer. Again, we have the get AD computer command as well. Here's one, test computer secure channel. This is where you can verify or repair a trust relationship between the computer and the domain. Because remember, again, that a computer does technically have a password, and it needs to have that secure channel with that password with the domain. And speaking of password, you could do reset computer machine password. Okay, so one thing I want to point out with all of these commands is I just want you to understand that just about everything you're seeing here, you should, in your mind, be able to picture where and how you would do this in the GUI. In other words, pretty much everything I'm talking about here, there's nothing unique that's like, oh, this is the only way to do this. That's one of the cool things that they did with the operating system is everything is built on top of PowerShell, which means everything you can do in PowerShell, you can also do through the graphical user interface. Okay, so all these various things that I'm showing you, you should already know how to do. This is just how to do it with PowerShell, which gives you some real power when it comes to scripting. The last chart that I have here is just real quick. Again, some of the parameters when it comes to creating the computer accounts. Not a whole lot, it's just a computer account. You can give it a name, you give it a path, and you can enable it. And then also the fourth object, just real fast here, OUs, you got new, set, get, and remove for AD organizational unit. And of course, when you're creating OUs, you got the name, the path. And check out this one, protected from accidental deletion. Okay, remember that one when we created OUs? We're going to actually take a quick look at that one. And we will see how to go ahead and check or uncheck that box, protected from accidental deletion. And so with that, let's jump over to the operating system and actually play with PowerShell a little bit. Okay, so here we are over on a Windows server. Now I happen to be on NYDC1. This is our main domain controller for the globalmantics.local domain. But we don't have to be. If you want to follow along, you just have to be on any computer that has Windows Server 2012 because PowerShell exists on all Server 2012 computers, not just domain controllers. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to open up Active Directory users and computers. Now, we're not really going to do anything in here, right, because this is all about PowerShell. This is all about doing command line and scripting, but we're going to leave this open and jump back and forth to it so that you can see the results of some of our PowerShell commands since we are managing Active Directory. Now the first thing I want to point out, and I mentioned this in the OU lesson, and you may have even been thinking during that lesson, well, why is he telling me this? Well, we're going to see some of why that is here. That the built-in containers, with the exception of domain controllers, they're actually just considered container objects. Whereas if you have this little icon on the folder right here, which you see on domain controllers, you see on New York, that means that it's an organizational unit. Okay, and that's, as I was just talking about when we talk about the LDAP distinguished name, that if it's an OU, it'll have OU equals, where if it's a container, like users, it's just CN equals. But let's go ahead and jump over to PowerShell. So down here on my taskbar, I do have PowerShell pinned, but I don't like using the regular PowerShell utility. I like using PowerShell ISE. So I'm going to right-click and select Windows PowerShell ISE. Now in the Intro to PowerShell lesson, I talked about why I like this one better, in the sense that I feel that the IntelliSense is so much better, where it auto-populates. I don't have to know at what point to go ahead and hit tab and start to get a list. It'll just be there. So that's why I like using this utility. So let me go ahead and maximize this utility so we can see it all the way. And you'll see that I have my prompt, and I also have all of my commands over on the right. We're not going to use those commands on the right for this particular lesson. We're just going to use the prompt. And let's just go ahead and start off by showing you that if I type in new dash, now immediately it's already showing me everything new that I could create. If I type in AD, it shows me everything that I can create in Active Directory. But I'm going to start to type O for organizational unit. You'll notice there's two things here, object or organizational unit. If I type R, all I have is organizational unit. I can hit tab. It populates it all in for me. And I'm going to give this organizational unit the name PowerShell and hit enter. Now you saw a quick flash there where it had to load the module because it had never been loaded before. Okay, that's one other cool thing about PowerShell. It'll kind of auto bring things in. If you ask it to do a command and it needs to load something for the command, it'll kind of load it on demand. Other than that, it looks like it didn't do anything, right? New AD organizational unit PowerShell, and I just get back to a prompt. That's actually a good thing. It's assumed that things worked correctly if you don't see an error. Okay, we'd see an error come up if we had typed something incorrectly. Now to validate this, let me jump over to Active Directory users and computers. And I have to hit refresh to refresh the screen. And boom, you'll see there's an organizational unit called PowerShell. If I jump back over to here, back over to our PowerShell ISE, let's create something in that organizational unit. So I'm going to say new, and this time it's going to be ADU for AD user. Notice real quick here, there's a lot of options, way more than what I showed you when we were just talking about what we can do when creating a user. I just showed you, the table that I had up on the screen, that just showed you maybe some of the more common things that we're going to do. But as you can see from the help that popped up, there's a lot more we can do. So new AD user, and then we have to give that user a name. Okay, so we're going to say name. And what do we want the name to be? Well, I'm going to put the name in quotes, and you're going to see why in just a minute. I'm going to put in the quotes, PowerShell space user, end quotes. Why did I use the quotes? Well, I use the quotes because there's a space in the name. And as you can see from our commands, using a space very often means we're going to the next component of the command. So in order for PowerShell to know that this is all part of the name, we have to put it in quotes. What else do we want to do here besides just the name? Well, let's go ahead and say that the given name is going to be PowerShell. And notice I didn't need the quotes because there's no space. It's all one name together. And the given name, of course, is the first name of a user. And then the surname, we're just going to do user, right? So it's like first name PowerShell, last name user. That's what the surname is. The display name, now this one we do need to have the quotes again, is going to be PowerShell space user, end quotes. And then let's give it a path, right? Just so that we know where we want to create this user. So I'm going to do dash path. And then in quotes, very important we do the quotes here because we're going to do a distinguished name. And so there's going to be commas. There could be spaces. In this case, they'll just be commas. But you always want to have a distinguished name in quotes. So let's put it in the OU PowerShell, comma, DC equals Globomantics. Now, it's important that we do DC equals Globomantics, comma, DC equals local. It's real common for people to make the mistake to do DC equals Globomantics dot local. And that's not correct. It's DC equals Globomantics, comma, DC equals local, end quotes. And if I've typed everything correctly, let me hit enter. Hey, look at that. We didn't get any error. We like that. If I jump down here to Active Directory users and computers, go to our PowerShell container, there it is. PowerShell user, just what we wanted to see. Now let's jump back over here to PowerShell. And what else do we want to do with this user? Well, we could do something like set AD account See, look at that. It's not working, and the reason is because I put a space in. Let me back up here. Set dash AD account. Look at that. See, now it works much better. And I will show you that at this point, if I didn't want to keep typing, I can actually scroll with my arrows through these choices. So I'm going to go to password and hit tab. And then we have to say for what user we want to set this password. So it's going to be, in quotes, PowerShell user. And I'm going to hit enter and watch what happens. Now this, and I want to point out a few things here real quick. First of all, in the text up in the PowerShell utility, you'll see it says, please enter the current password for, and it puts in the LDAP distinguished name for the user account, right? We have CN equals PowerShell user, OU PowerShell, DC Global Semantics, DC Local. And then it's showing password with colon. But then there's also a box that opens up, right? Windows PowerShell ISC input. This is the box we're going to actually type it in. What I want to point out is this is designed to never have to touch the mouse. Okay, you'll notice I haven't moved my mouse. I intentionally didn't move the arrow or anything. We have a blinking cursor where it's waiting for me to enter the password. Now the password right now, because we didn't establish it when we created the account, is blank. So I'm just going to hit enter. And I am going to move my arrow here just to show you. Notice that OK is what's actually highlighted by default. The idea is I can just hit enter. And then it now says, please enter the desired password. So I'm going to put in a desired password, which you can't see. It's a bunch of dots. I hit enter. Now it wants me to repeat the password. I'll put it in again. Hit enter. Well, we didn't get any errors. We must have set the password. It's very important to understand that it will always, everything that we do here, if you see one of these input boxes come up, it will default, and I love that Microsoft thought about this, it will default to what you most typically are going to want it to be at, to not have to use the mouse, to not have to jump over here, move over, and click on something. Now, I could jump over to a client machine and log in with this user using that password to prove that it worked. I'm not going to here because you're not going to be able to see it anyway. You won't be able to see what password I'm typing in, so you're just going to have to take my word for it that the password did get entered. Now what I do want to show you, let me jump over here to Active Directory. I want to show you this tiny little down arrow here showing you that this PowerShell user is currently disabled. And the reason I want to show you that is, what do you think I'm going to do? Yep, that's right. I'm going to enable it. So I'm going to say enable -AD account. And again, we have to say that it's going to be the PowerShell user account, right? That's the one that we want to do. And I'm going to hit enter. No errors. Jump over and say Active Directory users computer. Yes, I know it's still disabled. That's because I have to refresh. Now, this will refresh on its own eventually if I don't click the button. Okay, but just to save time, I'm going to go ahead and click the refresh. And you'll see the arrow has gone away, which means the account is now enabled. So what else can we do? Let's have a little fun with this. Let's create a new AD group. And we will call this PowerShell users, plural, as opposed to the PowerShell user that we just did. And let's give it a path. And that path, of course, is going to be the distinguished name. So we'll say OU equals PowerShell, comma, DC equals Global Semantics, comma, DC equals local. But we're not done there. Typically, when you create a group, you want to do a group scope. And that group scope is going to be global. And then we also want to do a group category. And the group category is going to be security. Right? We want this to be a security group. If I hit enter, no errors. I'm not even going to jump over and show you. Let's just keep going here. I'm going to add AD group member. And so we're going to take the PowerShell, if I could type, PowerShell users group, right? That's the group that we want to add the member to. And then I'm going to say the members are going to be, in this case, it's going to be PowerShell user. Hit enter. Again, no errors. Looking good so far. Jump over here to Active Directory. If I refresh this screen in this PowerShell container, you'll see that we now have a group called PowerShell users. It's a security group. Global, be specific, it's a global security group. If I go into the properties of this group, first of all, this is again where you see security, it's global. Go to the members tab. Hey, look at that. PowerShell user, if I expand this over here, is a member of this group. Everything worked. Pretty cool, huh? Well, there's really only one more thing that I'd like to show you, and that is we've done a lot of creating and manipulating of accounts in Active Directory. What about the opposite? What if we were to remove the group that we just created? All right, so we're going to remove PowerShell users. You get a dialog box. And again, I want to point out, I'm not going to touch the mouse. It says, are you sure you want to do this? It defaults to yes. Okay, it defaults that most likely the answer is yes. It's just a confirmation box. So I'm going to hit enter. And I've removed that group. I could remove AD user PowerShell user. Again, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I'm sure. And then I want you to pay very close attention to what happens next. I'm going to say that I want to remove AD organizational unit. And I'm going to put in PowerShell. This is really no different than removing the group or removing the user, right? But when you're doing an organizational unit, you're going to get an error. And the reason you get the error is because you have to do it with the distinguished name. So instead of saying remove AD organizational unit PowerShell, I have to say remove AD organizational unit, and then in quotes put OU equals PowerShell, comma, DC equals Globomantics, comma, DC equals local. And hit enter. Are you sure you want to perform this action? So that's a good thing, right? We didn't get that message before. That means it found it. But watch what happens when I click yes. We're still going to get another error. And the error that we're getting is that we don't have the privileges, or that you may have the checkbox for protect from accidental deletion. Okay, so that's why we're getting an error here. Even though it just says access is denied. I don't know if you can see that right here. Okay, access is denied. And then it says permission denied. The reality is, you and I know it's not an access thing. It's not a permission thing. It's that we have that box checked. So I'm going to go to a PowerShell command to eliminate that box. And actually, I'll tell you what, before we do, let's just go confirm that that is the reason. If I jump over here, first of all, if I refresh, you'll notice the user in the group is gone. If I go to View, Advanced Features, if I look at the properties of this container, you'll see that that box is checked. So let me cancel out of here, right? We don't want to uncheck that box. I want to do a PowerShell command for this. So I'm going to set AD organizational unit PowerShell protect from accidental deletion 0. Now, I'm wondering if you caught what I did here, because I made a mistake. We're going to get an error again. Watch, I'm going to hit enter. You'll see there's an error. It can't find PowerShell. Why? Because you have to use the distinguished name. So let's go ahead and try this again. Set AD organizational unit. And I'm not just going to type in PowerShell. I'm going to put in OU equals PowerShell, comma, DC equals Globomantics, comma, DC equals local, end quotes. Now, let's do protect from accidental deletion to 0. 0 meaning turn it off, right? 1 means go ahead and protect it. 0 means stop protecting it. So I'm going to hit enter. I did not get an error this time. Let's jump back over here to Active Directory. Let's look at the properties of this container. Go to the Object tab. The box is no longer checked. Let me stop looking at advanced features. Jump back over to PowerShell. And this time, let me use the up arrow just to scroll through some of the commands that I've done to the one that I want, which is remove AD organizational unit with the full distinguished name so we know that it finds it. Hit enter. It says, are you sure? I hit enter again to say, yes, I'm sure. I don't get an error. I jump back over here, hit refresh, and the PowerShell organizational unit is now gone. So as you can see, there's quite a bit that you can do to manage Active Directory objects using PowerShell. And I will tell you, I'll just kind of reemphasize, I said this back in the PowerShell lesson itself. If you're thinking to yourself, man, that seemed like a lot of work, and oh man, you made typos, and there's the need for typing in the distinguished name at certain places, and oh, this is so much work compared to just pointing and clicking in the GUI. Remember, the idea behind PowerShell, besides allowing you to work from the command prompt if that's what you prefer, but more specifically, it allows for scripting. So if you know you're going to do things on a somewhat regular basis, if you have to do it again and again and again, you can save that PowerShell command or a set of commands in the form of a script and then just run that script, which is way easier than having to point and click or anything else. That's why we manage AD objects with PowerShell. And so that brings us to the end of this lesson, where we've now seen all the various commandlets that are used with Windows PowerShell to manage Active Directory domain services. And every individual is going to decide on their own how they will use Windows PowerShell to assist them in managing, well, not only Active Directory, but really anything in Windows Server 2012. But one of the main things that I think you'll do, and I know I'll do when it comes to managing Active Directory domain services, is kind of the bulk processes that we talked about in the lesson. All right, so take from it what you want. And again, as I said in the beginning of the lesson, I encourage you to go out and learn a lot more about PowerShell and get real good with it. But other than that, that's what I have for you in this lesson. And I'll see you in the next one.